It's hard to believe that I'm sitting in front of the most polluted river in the United States. That's because I'm not. That's in Ohio, which is miles away, and kind of dangerous. In fact, the Hudson River doesn't even make the top 10 most polluted rivers in the country. You still would not catch me swimming in here, though. 27 billion gallons of sewage are dumped in the Hudson River every year. But believe it or not, that's an improvement from how bad it used to be. How is that so? Let's dive into the history of the Hudson River. No pun intended. In the early 20th century, the Hudson River was a hotspot for swimmers, boaters, and fishermen in all sorts of recreational activities, provided you can muster up the costly fee of 10 cents. But of course, growing populations and demand for resources eventually came around and ruined everything. Factories were built to produce supplies to build cars, process food, and to help the war effort. But with big factories comes big amounts of waste. And where did the factory owners decide the best place to dump all this trash was? Well, of course, it had to be the water where everyone swims in. By 1944, all Hudson River beaches were shut down because of pollution. There goes that industry. What does this have to do with oysters? Henry Hudson first arrived in New York in 1609, and at the mouth of his namesake river, he discovered a zone of cool, crystal-clear brackish water with lots to do with oysters. Henry Hudson first arrived in New York in 1609, and at the mouth of his namesake river, he discovered a zone of cool, crystal-clear brackish water with lots of shallow, rocky areas. In other words, oyster heaven. There was estimated to be 350 miles worth of oyster beds, with some growing as large as 10 inches. Jackpot, or should I say snack pot. New York became oyster central. In the 1700s, oysters were a staple food for the poor. They were cheap, nutritious, tasty, and best of all, cheap. The shells had the added benefit of being a good mix-in for mortar, so the streets were literally paved with oysters. The downside was that they didn't wash them properly first, so you can imagine what that smelled like. The more famous oyster establishments opened in the 1800s, where they were served every way you could think of. Fried, broiled, or First Lady Dolly Madison's favorite, served in ice cream. As you can imagine, this meant great things for the fishing industry. Meanwhile, New York's population was growing, and therefore growing in demand. Fisheries were harvesting more and more and more. But then factories were built, the water was polluted, and the oyster populations declined. Not that anyone wanted to eat them at this point, because by 1913, restaurants stopped serving oysters from the Hudson because the water was too polluted. There was even an outbreak of typhoid fever in 1924 caused by people eating oysters from beds contaminated by feces. By 1927, the last oyster fishery closed. Now people have to get their oysters from exotic locations, like Long Island. You would think that everyone would have been in a huge panic at this point to get the water clear so that they could continue farming their beloved oysters. You would be mistaken. It wasn't until 1972 that the government realized that it was a bad thing to dump pollution directly into open waters, without proper certification at least. The Clean Water Act was passed, and it was ruled unlawful to dump pollutants into navigable waters. 40 or so years later, the water has cleared up quite a bit, but not enough for the oyster population to return to its full glory. Well, there you have it. Humans once again screw up an ecosystem for future humans to enjoy. The Hudson River's polluted, oyster populations are down, such is life. Why are you still here? I told you everything you needed to know. Yes, it's depressing, but that's just how life works. There isn't going to be a savior. It's not like there's going to be someone who comes along and just plants a billion oysters. The Oyster Project is a multi-stage nonprofit organization that aims to restore 1 billion oysters to the Hudson River by 2035. The Billion Oyster Project. All right. What is it? Basically, exactly what it sounds like. The Nature Conservancy of New York organizes groups of volunteers, scientists, and even schools to work together and restore the oyster population in New York with the goal of restoring 1 billion by 2035. So far, they've restored 122 million live oysters. How does it work? This project starts in an unlikely place: seafood restaurants. The Billion Oyster Project has partnered with over 70 restaurants in order to collect used oyster shells after people have eaten them. You can actually save oysters by eating oysters. Over 2 million pounds of shells have been collected since 2014. But why? Well, the shells are used to rebuild reefs. When oysters spawn, their larvae are tiny, free-floating organisms that are just swimming around trying to find a good rock to latch on. These little guys are little, very little, and in the natural environment, little things are very susceptible to death. Whether it be predation, weather, or harsh chemicals, the larvae need time to build up a tolerance to live in a harsh environment. The larvae are placed into empty oyster shells so that they have a solid place to secure themselves. The shells are arranged so that the oysters form a wall and form a natural barrier that protects them from predators and changes in the weather and current. Safety in numbers. But now, I know what you've been asking yourself through this whole thing. Why are we bothering to restore oysters of all things? I mean, they're basically just rocks with snot inside. Well, these living snot rocks still have to eat, and they do so by filtering water through their shells and digesting any plankton that happens to be caught in it. But an unintended consequence of this filter feeding is that they suck up toxins and excess algae that may otherwise be damaging water quality. A fully grown oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in one day. Multiply that by the 122 million restored, that's 6.1 billion gallons a day. Along with this, oyster reefs provide a much-needed habitat for many aquatic animals, such as crabs and flounder. The reefs are also credited with forming breakwaters, which protect coastlines from weather damage. That's a lot of weight for someone with no brain to carry. Well, there you have it, your chunk of hope for New York's nasty waters. I bet you didn't think those gray mollusks would be so interesting. Next time you encounter one, be it in the ocean or on the half shell, make sure to thank it. It would be shellfish, not to.